Well, my next guests know military procurement, the process inside out, what's caused so many problems and maybe what's needed to make it better. They've been paying close attention to the government's efforts to fix the system. Let's find out what they think. Elinor Sloan is a professor of international relations in the Department of Political Science at Carleton University and a former analyst with the Department of National Defence. David Perry is the Vice President and Senior Analyst with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and Sahir Khan is the Executive Vice President of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. He's a former Assistant Parliamentary Budget Officer. Thank you all for coming in to talk about this important subject. We've heard from the Minister today about her thoughts on how she's moving forward with the procurement process, and she believes making progress. But let me just open it up to get opening comments from the three of you. How is the government doing at fulfilling that promise of fixing once and for all Canada's broken military procurement system in this country? How's she doing? How's the government doing? Who wants to start?
So, I mean, just to start with, in terms of fixing it, they've outlined that they're going to continue with some initiatives that the previous government had started, which are all good stuff, but they haven't really come to fruition. But in terms of the dollar amounts of what's actually been spent, they're doing about the same, but a little bit worse than the tail end of the Harper government. I think the real key thing is that they're handling around the fighter jet file has really colored perceptions about how they're treating procurement writ large.
Okay, Elinor?
Well, I think the government went some ways to fix the procurement problems in its most recent defense policy statement, the Strong, Secure, Engaged, that came out last June. But the problem there is with respect to procurement, while the document talked about a lot of changes within the Department of National Defence, it didn't deal with the bigger picture, which is procurement across the government, dealing with D&D, public works, and the industry component. And that often ends up being something that stops defense procurement.
Sahir Khan?
I think they get good marks, I think, from the policy statement in terms of, I think for the first time in a long time, we have some coherence between what a government wants to do and then how that might relate to its procurement strategy. I think we take a step back, there's still a bigger problem. I think it's a big political problem in Canada. You have governments trying to reconcile among kind of competing objectives. We want to create jobs in Canada. We want to operate within a really narrow fiscal envelope, and we want to deliver the requirements of the Canadian forces. We haven't really reconciled among those forces and really allocated enough money to decide that we can do all of them. And we don't seem to want to have the conversation about which are the real priorities and how do we actually adjust the way we do this in a more fundamental way. I think we play with the institutions, but I think the real issue is the political question. Yeah,
do you all agree with that? And if so, I mean, what effect has that been having on procurement for, I suppose, for decades in this country?
I agree to an extent, but I think that the government has in fact decided on some of those priorities and increased some of the economic component of that and the defense industrial component of that in a way that some people disagree with. I mean, we're seeing that on shipbuilding as an example. Our shipbuilding strategy is a strategy both to buy ships, but also to establish and recreate a defense industrial base. So there's, in some sectors at least, the government's actually chosen and it's weighted at least more than previous governments had the reestablishment and the economic priority more so than in the past.
Right, and that's is that the right way to go? I mean, we have it. I mean, does every other country do this? Does every other country say, if you want to bid on a major procurement contract in the military in our country, you know, show us the money, show us what you're going to do for to help, you know, build our industry here and help put people to work in the country that's for whom you're supplying the product.
Yeah, that's true, but not every country tries to optimize on every variable at the same time. So, for example, we have European allies, Netherlands, the UK, that are starting to build some of the lower value-added components, the ship hulls, for example, in lower cost countries or higher productivity countries, and saving kind of the higher value-added aspect of the project for their country. And they're starting to rationalize this. I think there's a public expectation that they're going to have to, something's going to have to give, and if there's less money available, then there's going to have to be some rationalization taking place. They've all kind of benefited, it's bad use of the word, benefited from some kind of fiscal crisis, which kind of forces that decision making. We've really not had the discussion in Canada.
I mean, does it, sorry, Elinor, go ahead.
I was just going to say that every country does it to a certain degree. Canada has made it formalized as with the industrial and technological benefits that go into our defense contracting. We didn't always do it that way. This started at sort of I believe it was the mid-'80s that we started doing that, whereas we didn't used to do that. Other countries have it to a certain degree, but they do go off the shelf. You hear about ships being bought from South Korea that are less expensive and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's no, I guess, is it good for the taxpayers, the bottom line? I mean, it does, I suppose it does, and some people argue this, I guess, David, does it build an industry or prop up an industry that otherwise wouldn't survive if you didn't have those regional incentives built into big procurement contracts? But at the front end, in the bidding process, if a company has to provide local incentives, isn't it all built into the bidding process? I mean, Canadian taxpayers are paying for it, aren't they?
In a lot of cases, but there's been some recent studies showing that if you look more fulsomely at the economic impact, what you get back in economic spin-off and tax revenues at least offsets, or in some cases can potentially outweigh. But the problem is that this comes out of specific departmental budgets, so that's really where the tension is. From the Government of Canada writ large, that point of view, there can be a net benefit to doing things at home, just in terms of the economics of it. From departmental budgets, it's a problem. But the other kind of consideration there, and the reason why I don't think that's necessarily bad at all, is that part of the problem in this country is getting political approval to move ahead on these projects. In a lot of instances, just the defense or strategic considerations on their own aren't enough to get a government to sign off and spend big bucks, and most of these things are big dollar items. Let's
talk about we've touched on it. I think it's the big ticket purchase, and there are a number of them, but it's been in the news so long, the fighter planes, that I think Canadians go, the fighter planes again, and when are we getting the fighter? Now we're looking at late 20s into the 2030 before we get a fleet of fighter planes. I mean, and that's kind of where this government said, I think it would make its mark. It was going to get this right. Is this plan the right plan? With the way the government's going about now, the process for getting new fighter planes here?
Well, but I think it's a good example of where we're not able to separate the politics and the utility of defense procurement in other kind of political policy realms. And that's where I think defense procurement will never be as simple as buying staplers. And I'm separating the complexity of the procurement itself. The fact is that it's a political instrument. And the moment we kind of add that dimension to it, we make an already very complex procurement process. I think Elinor talked about like the 3 departments already involved. Now we're going to layer international politics, we're going to trade politics, domestic politics, regional development. We're going to put all that on top of it, then ask that everything be done kind of on time and on budget.
But we're buying interim planes and taking, as I understand it, and speaking with the minister, it's about a 4-year process before we get to an actual I mean, the government may not even be the same government by the time this thing gets off the drawing board and actually gets into production. Is that the right way to go? I mean, or should they be scrapping the interim purchase and move this whole process up and get us to a plane supplier in the next 2 years?
Yeah. Well, my understanding is that the interim process is not actually delaying the competition for the new fighter jet, and so there's probably not a link there. But the issue is with the new fighter jet is that the government promised a competition 2 years ago, over 2 years ago. That was one of the first things they were supposed to do, and it took until last November to announce it. So it's long and drawn out, and could move an awful lot faster.
How's this been handled, David?
I think poorly, but by 2 governments successively. It was coming up on 8 years ago now that the Harper government announced a plan to buy aircraft, and then ended up walking back from that after a number of things happened. Went through a 3-year period of purgatory, effectively, where they were reviewing options and then didn't do anything with all the analysis that was done with that. You had a change in government. I think the Liberals made some commitments in their campaign platform that were really foolish, and they've had to inherit those statements and live with them. And then they effectively spent the first 2 years in office. I'm not quite sure doing what, but I would really, to me, there's a big problem about the timelines. Perhaps the biggest right now is, why did it take this long to be finally moving forward on a process which should have started years ago, to have a competition?
Is there a good answer as to why we don't already have a new fighter jet in this country, given as we've been talking about it for, what, 2 decades, 3 decades?
Well, it's very politically oriented, and the government, this new government, well, it's not new anymore, was when it entered, said it would not buy the Joint Strike Fighter, and yet that it would have an fair and open competition, and those 2 things just did not mesh.
Well, they still don't, do they? Because now it's a fair and open competition, but apparently the F-35 is back in the mix.
As it should be.
Although it was ruled out even before the government got into office.
Yeah, and let's also consider that within our system there are different forces acting on this issue. There are different procurements that are a favorite of officials, say within D&D, and others may have less of a policy priority on that issue and might want to get something that's less expensive. So you have this kind of Canadian Forces requirements that might be pushed from one faction, and then you have another group that might want to think about, okay, both political commitments, fiscal commitments, and reconciling those two is not easy, and this is part of the feature of our system.
Let's talk about this new approach that this government is taking to procurement. It's all procurement, but a lot of people call it the Boeing Clause because of the trade fight that Boeing had with Bombardier, and during that, the government decides to introduce, as part of the procurement policy, it's going to weigh bidding companies and what harm, what actions they may have taken to harm Canada's economic interests. And apparently it's there to stay. The Boeing-Bombardier fight looks like it's done, but the minister said in my conversation that they're working on criteria, and it may, they're looking at how far back do we look for companies' actions involving Canada. Does all of this make sense?
No. I think it's effectively going to be impossible to operationalize that in a way that will be legally defensible. You're talking about companies that generally have extraordinarily complicated sets of engagements and an integrated economy and integrated supply chains. Coming up with a simple pronouncement that they're either harming or hurting the economy in Canada, or conversely benefiting them and how much, coming up with a real clear assessment on that, I think is going to be virtually impossible.
Elinor, what do you think?
I don't think it's a good idea at all. It's added one more criteria to a list of many criteria that goes into a defense procurement, and I think it's going to slow down the process. It's going to introduce even more politics into a politicized process. It's not going to be a good thing.
Sahir Khan, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that if we think about the length of these procurement cycles, this is not the last criteria that may be added to this process. Every government's going to have a different lens on this issue. So once again, I think we're adding more complexity to a process that's already quite complex.
Is part of this, again, I mean, is this politics again? I mean, if you suppose you go through the whole process and Boeing is the winning candidate, but they still, would that be possible 15 years down the road, or 4 years down the road? It might be. But they had an outstanding trade fight involving Canada. Would that be the political out? Oh, sorry, you don't get the bid because you have this problem here. Is that what this is?
It's just unbelievable the way it has progressed, the whole fighter jet, because the government came in saying they wanted to buy the Super Hornet, which Boeing aircraft, not the Joint Strike Fighter from Lockheed Martin. And then 2 years later, the tables have changed completely, and now Boeing is in the bad box and looking at other fighter jets. And so it's just really quite remarkable how this story has changed over 2 years.
So the promise, let's finish on this. The promise from the government was we're going to fix the broken procurement system. They may be making progress. There's an election 2 years from now. Will they be able to say, do you think at that time they've fixed the procurement process based on what you're seeing so far?
Well, they haven't fixed the big picture. They perhaps started a fix on the small picture. And the smaller picture is the internal streamlining within the Department of National Defense. And they've set forth some ideas that will eventually make the process within national defense much more effective. But when it comes to the big picture, of course, you're still looking at these 3 departments plus Treasury Board involved in the process. And that's the part that they haven't tackled.
I think this is cultural. I think this is a part of a political culture, and I think it's bigger than this government. And I think it's about a very different conversation we have with Canadians about how we reconcile the needs of the Canadian Forces with every other policy objective we put into these procurement processes.
Should that make us pessimistic about getting the system fixed? Is it here to stay? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I find it ironic that the assets that are currently underused by the Canadian Forces were procured by Pierre-Elliott Trudeau. And that's the mainstay of the asset base of this government.
It's a troubling but good point. David, final thought to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the important thing for people to keep in mind is that it's not just a question of fixing the existing system and how much capacity it's had relative to the demands that were placed on it for the last 10 years. Last June, this government published a new policy which was putting in, at least in a policy framework, a lot of future spending to deliver equipment to the Canadian military, and I think rightly in the correct kind of areas. But it's going to require about a 4-fold increase in the procurement system's capacity measured in dollars if all that's going to come to fruition. So it's not just a question of whether or not they can spend a little bit more money than last year. Right. They're looking to have a 4-fold increase if they're going to look at actually delivering that new policy.
Okay, we'll see how they do in the next couple of years. Thank you all for your perspectives today. It's been useful and valuable to have your input. Thanks.
My pleasure.